Last time we met, we were partway into a new section of the Torah, new section of Deuteronomy, that covers from chapters 26 through 30. And what makes this section different than the previous 14 chapters is that the nature of the sermon being given by Moses changes. Chapters 12 through 26 recited the bulk of the law that had been given to Israel almost 40 years earlier at Mount Sinai. Further, it was now being done more in sermon style, as Moses expounded on the meaning and the life application of many of those laws and commandments that had been given that was very near the beginning of their journey, a few weeks after they left Egypt. Now here in this section, we move into some mystical aspects of God's Torah, whereby blessings and curses are pronounced. Prophecies of future happenings regarding Israel are presented, though the people of Israel probably didn't understand the prophetic nature of what was being said. Deep, inscrutable truths are implied, and straightforward admonitions and warnings are laid out. And as a result of the extraordinary nature of this section, we're going to rest here for a while. And I'm going to delve into a few aspects of the more complex, the more mysterious things that moving swiftly through it won't allow. Now, chapter 27 that we're about to open is often said by scholars to be out of place. That it seems as though some writer, well after the fact, wanted to make a particular point or to go back and clarify some earlier information. Some scholars think that an ancient editor discovered two or more slightly different traditions surrounding these events and simply included them both without regard to the difficulties of doing such a thing. Other competent Bible scholars would prefer to simply skip Deuteronomy chapter 27 altogether, just moving directly from 26 to 28, and then they say the flow makes more sense to their minds. I can't say any of this with certainty, whether it's the case or not. However, I can say that without doubt, one has to look very carefully at Deuteronomy 27, otherwise we can get the wrong idea about what's actually happening, and it can become confusing. So, with all that, let us read Deuteronomy chapter 27. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, it begins on page 226. Then Moses, and all the leaders of Israel gave orders to the people. They said, observe all the mitzvot, the commandments I'm giving you today. When you cross the Jordan to the land Adonai your God is giving you, you are to set up large stones and put plaster on them. And after crossing over, write his Torah on them, every word, so that you can enter the land that Adonai your God is giving to you, a land flowing with milk and honey, as Adonai the God of your ancestors promised you. When you have crossed the Jordan, you're to set up these stones, as I'm ordering you today, on Mount Ebal, and put plaster on them. There you are to erect an altar to Adonai your God, an altar made of stones. You're not to use any iron tool on them, but you're to build the altar of Adonai your God of uncut stones. You are to offer burnt offerings on it to Adonai your God. Also, you are to offer sacrifice peace offerings. Eat there, be joyful in the presence of Adonai your God. You are to write on the stones all the words of this Torah very clearly. Next, Moses and the priests who are Levites spoke to all Israel, and they said, be quiet and listen, Israel. Today you have become the people of Adonai your God. Therefore you are to listen to what Adonai your God says and obey his commandments and laws which I'm giving you today. That same day Moses commissioned the people as follows. These are the ones who are to stand on Mount Gerizim and bless the people after you have crossed the Jordan. Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Issachar, Yosef, and Benjamin. While these are to stand on Mount Ebal for the curse. Reuven, Gad, Asher, Zebulun, Dan, and Naphtali. The Levites, speaking loudly, will proclaim to every man of Israel, A curse on anyone who makes a carved or metal image, something Adonai detests, the handiwork of a craftsman, and he sets it up in secret. All the people are to respond by saying Amen. A curse on anyone who dishonors his father or mother. All the people are to say Amen. A curse on anyone who moves his neighbor's boundary marker. All the people are to say Amen. A curse on anyone who causes a blind person to lose his way on the road. And all the people are to say Amen. A curse on anyone who interferes with justice, for the foreigner, for the orphan, for the widow. All the people are to say Amen. A curse on anyone who has sexual relations with his father's wife, because he's violated his father's rights, and all the people are to say Amen. A curse on anyone who has sexual relations with any kind of animal. All the people are to say Amen. A curse on anyone who has sexual relations with his sister, no matter whether she's the daughter of his father or of his mother. All the people are to say Amen. A curse on anyone who has sexual relations with his mother-in-law. The people are to say Amen. A curse on anyone who secretly attacks a fellow member of the community. All the people are to say Amen. A curse on anyone who accepts a bribe to kill an innocent person. All the people are to say Amen. A curse on anyone who does not confirm the words of this Torah by putting them into practice. All the people are to say Amen. That last one's a real killer, isn't it? The thing to understand is this. What we are witnessing are covenant renewal ceremonies. And even though the Mosaic covenant was agreed to and handed down almost 4 decades earlier out in the wilderness, God was now, through Moses, calling on the people of Israel to renew their vows as regards their commitment to this covenant and to remember how and why it was established in the first place. I said that we are witnessing covenant renewal ceremonies, plural, more than one, even though it may not seem so at a casual reading. Now, how do I come to that conclusion? Moses was speaking at least part of the time. Yet, part of this admonition is that there is to be a ceremony after Israel crosses the Jordan River and takes possession of Canaan. Now, further, verse 9 says that Moses, together with the Levite priests, spoke the words that were presented to the people. These two circumstances could not have happened at the same time because Moses died before Israel crossed over the Jordan. Not allowing Moses into the promised land was a punishment imposed upon him by Jehovah in response to an incident whereby Moses struck a rock to bring forth water instead of speaking to it, which is what the Lord instructed him to do. Now, further, we know that Israel crossed into Canaan just above the northern tip of the Dead Sea at a place called Gilgal, only a stone's throw from the ancient city of Jericho. Yet in the verses just preceding the ones we just read, it seems as though this covenant renewal ceremony is to be done, on the one hand, immediately upon crossing the Jordan, which was at Gilgal, but on the other hand, it must be performed atop the twin mountain peaks of Ebal and Gerizim. The problem is these two mountains are 30 miles north of Gilgal and Jericho, and due to their location and the number of people that would attend, its journey to get there is probably a week. So on the surface it implies that we have Moses in Canaan at Mount Ebal, and immediately upon crossing the Jordan, he's leading the priests in a covenant renewal ceremony, none of which squares with any other scripture. Let's see if we can untangle this. What we are dealing with is at least 2, probably 3 different covenant renewal ceremonies. When Moses is identified as the one who is speaking, we can know with certainty that this part of the oracle took place on the mountains of Moab, just before he died, about a month later than Israel would cross into Canaan. Therefore, we have Moses saying to Israel as they were listening to this extended sermon, which is what Deuteronomy is, the words contained in verses 9 and 10. Next, we have verses 11 and 12 and 13. These are instructions from Moses as to what the people are to do later, after he's dead, after these are in Canaan. And then in verse 14 it says, the Levites, speaking loudly, will proclaim to every man of Israel. It says nothing of Moses joining in. That seems at odds with the preceding verses that has Moses speaking with the Levites. So what we have is a change of location occurring between verses 13 and 14. And in verse 13, the location is still Moab, where Moses is speaking. Verse 14, the location is inside of Canaan, with the Levite priests announcing the blessings and the curses. Now, therefore, as our reading began today, the present situation was that the Hebrew people were gathered in Moab listening to Moses' grand sermon. And he's reminding them that as of today, that day, they become Jehovah's people. Now, wait a minute. I thought they became God's people back at Mount Sinai. What's different about today? The difference is that back on Sinai, the land was still just an unfulfilled promise. This congregational meeting in Moab, as the Israelites are looking across the Jordan to the promised land, is essentially the Israelites' graduation ceremony. The time in the wilderness is officially over. And the time in their own land, which is in fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant, is beginning. The crux is that many of the regulations of the Mosaic covenant depend on Israel residing, settled in their own land, not out in the wilderness. They couldn't do many of those things until their land was in their possession. They couldn't use the required wine and ritual observances because they had no vineyards. They couldn't perform first fruits ceremonies because they grew no crops. They had no harvest. They couldn't eat as the Torah required because their primary food was still manna. When the people of Israel are disconnected from the land of Israel, they are incomplete. Both are incomplete. While Israel was wandering in the wilderness, they could only do some of the law. Not all of it. Because there was no means to do certain specified things that revolved around agriculture, as did, for instance, at least and arguably at least 3 and possibly 5 of the 7 biblical feasts revolve around agriculture. Further, at the time they were receiving this word from Moses, the first Exodus generation had died off. Those who were of the age of accountability upon leaving Egypt, defined in the Torah as those old enough to serve in the military, were the ones who personally witnessed the original giving of the law on Mount Sinai. They were the ones who shouted in united affirmation that they would obey all of the Torah's terms. But that group was dead, gone. A divinely ordered consequence of their disobedience to the Lord by refusing to enter the promised land. Remember that? Decades earlier. So back out into the wilderness they went. So it would be a new generation of Hebrews entering Canaan, who were either young children or not even born yet at the time of the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. And during this time in the wilderness, it is clear that only parts of the law were followed. Some because they couldn't, others because they didn't want to. In fact, apparently male circumcision didn't occur in the wilderness. Perhaps only a few did it. Therefore, a mass circumcision ceremony would occur right after they entered the land. The Lord wanted the new generation who entered the land that was promised to them for so long ago to hear the law with their own ears, to personally accept and affirm the covenant in their lives. This is the reason for Moses' words of verses 9 and 10 that today they are God's people. They are accepting this covenant. This still existent attitude of every Hebrew throughout history, that each individual is to affirm the law as though it had just been given to him or her personally. This mindset is to be as though he or she personally marched out of Egypt and stood at the foot of Mount Sinai. All that's demonstrated right here in Deuteronomy 27. Now, I mentioned that another aspect of the reason that Moses considered the occasion of his sermon in Moab as the day that Israel became God's people was that they were officially receiving the lands, and that Hebrews without the land are incomplete. Both are incomplete. The land's incomplete, the people are incomplete. It is ironic today that the Hebrews finally do have that land again. Yet in some ways, they're still incomplete. At least that is the mindset of the most religious among them. And you know why that is? They don't have a temple. My good friend, our good friend, Rabbi Baruch, likes to say that in our era, the Torah is not in force. He's right. The rabbis also agree with him. And by that statement, he means not that the Torah is dead and gone or that it shouldn't be followed, but rather that just as when the Hebrews were out in the wilderness, there was much law that couldn't and can't in our day be followed. In our era, the Torah cannot be used as a civil law system because at the heart of that system is a temple and a priesthood. It doesn't exist. The Exodus Hebrews did experience the presence of the tabernacle and the priesthood and the Ark of the Covenant, so it was possible for them to employ the Torah law as a full-fledged legal system. But today's Jews do not have God's dwelling place among them, even though they're back in the land. The temple is a vital part of obedience to and functionality of the Torah. And thus Ezekiel prophesies that not only will there be a rebuilt temple, but that the sacrifices and the other temple-dependent observances will begin once in the future, once again allowing the Torah to be a fully functional legal system. And to use evangelical Christian terms, this will be during the millennium, the 1,000-year reign of Messiah. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time with this today, but it's important you understand something. Most of the laws of ritual purity and of atonement for sin depend on the existence of a temple. Without a temple, and the priests who perform those rituals, a critical link in the change of Torah observance and legal procedure is missing. Even Shabbat cannot fully meet Torah standards because the Torah requires certain sacrifices for the Sabbath. And obviously these can't be done without a temple, an altar, and priests to perform the sacrifices. All important first fruit ceremonies cannot be done because there is no temple or priesthood to present the first fruits to. Yom Kippur can't be properly observed according to the Torah standards because there's no high priest to go into the Holy of Holies and to sprinkle blood onto an ark that's gone missing for 2,500 years. I could go on for quite a while giving you examples of Torah laws and regulations that require temple and priesthood participation. With a little more time in preparation, I could spend quite some time showing you how those required Torah rituals that cannot be performed affect other aspects of Torah commandments that on the surface don't seem to be attached to a temple, but in fact they are, if only in an indirect way. The Torah law and the temple are and have always been and will always be completely intertwined. Now that doesn't mean that it's wrong or fruitless to observe some of these ceremonies. Of course, it's not wrong to observe the commandments of Torah as far as one can. as a demonstration of our personal trust in God, our desire to be in harmony with Him and His universe, our intent to be obedient to God's laws and commandments out of our gratitude to Him. Some of the laws can be observed in spirit only. But to use the Torah laws as any sort of self-justification method or an attempt at self-righteousness is more futile today than when there was a temple. To pretend that we are keeping Torah in a pure way is folly. To claim that we are Torah observant is in many ways hypocritical. Without a temple, without a priesthood, it is physically impossible to fully or correctly carry out Torah because too many of the procedural elements are unavailable to us. All the elements must be in place for the Torah to be fully observed. The people, the land, the temple, the priesthood. It seems as though Israel has been without at least one of these elements for almost all of their existence. Therefore, you'll understand why it is that the most religious and fervent Jews have such a zealous desire to have their temple rebuilt and the priesthood reestablished. They full well understand their predicament. It's also fascinating to understand that in the near future, all three elements will exist once again, and Torah observance will be possible, yet even though only to a point. Now, what I have been describing is just one of an unknown number of mysterious aspects of this section of Deuteronomy. The idea that only as of the moment of the actual and formal giving of the promised land to Israel could Israel finally perform its part of that mutual obligation treaty that they had established with God, called the Covenant of Moses. It has so many facets to it. And I've only lightly touched upon a few of them. Well, in verse 11, a fascinating aspect of this renewal ceremony is to take place. Israel gets divided into two groups, 6 tribes each. One group goes to Mount Ebal, the other to ascend Mount Gerizim. And a very specific listing of the composition of each group is ordained. And while it is difficult to find anything particularly special about each group, this much can be said about it. The group that is assigned to the task of pronouncing the blessings are made up of 2 sons of Rachel, which was Jacob's favorite wife, and 4 of Leah's sons. Remember, she was technically Jacob's first wife. Leah and Rachel were sisters. The group that pronounces the curses is going to be made up mostly of the sons of Jacob's concubines, plus Reuben, who, although he was Jacob's true firstborn, he was removed from that position because he had sexual relations with one of Jacob's concubines. And then finally, the youngest son of Leah was included. So perhaps this might have something to do with the selection. That's my speculation. But what I find more interesting is that the overall composition of the tribes of Israel has changed back to its original pre-Exodus makeup. Now recall that we had the original 12 sons of Jacob. Then Jacob shockingly adopted 2 of the Egyptian sons of Joseph away from him, Ephraim and Manasseh. And he included them, who are really his grandsons, as among the tribes of Jacob. He now has 14 sons, 14 tribes. Then Joseph was removed as a tribal name, bringing the total down to 13. Then Levi was removed as a regular tribe of Israel in order for them to become God's priests, his servants. That brings us back to 12. But it's not the original 12. And this new tribal makeup is what was used to divide the land when Moses was in charge and to assign all of its territories. Here, however, we have the two sons of Joseph removed from this tribal listing, and Joseph is added back in. Plus, Levi is also counted again as among the regular 12 tribes. Why this happens, I'm not sure. Except that I think that it's prophetic. We know, looking ahead in the prophetic books of the Bible, like Ezekiel, that the original tribal configuration, pre-Exodus, is going to be restored when Christ comes back. But notice this as well. We read in Exodus 39 that the ephod of the high priest has two large stones mounted onto the shoulder straps, one stone on each shoulder strap. And upon these stones are written the names of the 12 tribes of Israel, 6 names on each stone. Now, can you picture the imagery of two hilltops? Ebal and Gerizim is represented by the two stones on the high priest's shoulders, with 6 tribes inscribed in each one corresponding to the 2 hills upon 6 tribes are to present themselves. There's been a great deal of conjecture about which tribes were listed on each of the shoulder stones. I suspect that the logic behind which tribes were chosen to appear on each hill was probably taken from the way the shoulder stones of the high priest were inscribed. Again, that's just my speculation. We're not told. In verse 15 begins a series of 12 curses that are to be pronounced by the priests. Now, the Hebrew word for curse is used here is arur. And the sense of the word arur is one of a divinely imposed misfortune, a God calamity. The disaster that befalls you is perhaps because the Lord sent this disaster upon you as punishment. It's wrath. Or that he pulled perhaps his hand of blessing and protection upon you, and he let some evil from some source affect you. Or he could have intervened, but he decided not to. The great Hebrew sages say that the priests of the Exodus went to the mountaintops of Ebal and Gerizim along with the tribal prince, probably the chief elders of each tribe, remember, divided into 2 groups of 6, as we saw. The remaining members of the associated tribes congregated down the large valley between Mounts Ebal and Gerizim, with one group of 6 tribes facing towards the corresponding mountain and the other group doing the same, but in the opposite direction. From Mount Ebal, the curses would be pronounced. Now, 11 specific sins are elaborated, the commission of which was to call down a curse upon an Israelite for committing them. Then a 12th, rather general trespass is called out. Now, each of these 11 specific sins has already been dealt with in the law of Moses, and many of them have the curse of the death penalty associated with them. So why the choice of these particular 11 sins? What is different? What's special about these 11? Now, first understand that this list of sins is representative, it is not exhaustive. That is, the Torah has not been reduced to 11 or 12 sins that bring divine punishment. Rather, these 11 are representative of a type or a category of sin. The type that can be done in secret or are very difficult for their victims to publicize or to prove their case. In other words, they are sins that are more often than not known only to God, to the criminal, and to the victim. Earthly justice by means of the law code is not likely to happen because of the secrecy of the act. Second of all, the 2 curses brought about by some specific sin concerns two of the Ten Commandments, making a God image and dishonoring one's parents. Although we covered this at length back in Exodus, it's good to remember that at all times the Hebrews have believed and practiced that the admonition against God images refers both to false gods and to the God of Israel. Needless to say, this may have been the single most violated commandment of them all throughout Israelite history. And I maintain that the modern Christian denominational icons and images that we tend to use so liberally today, with so little thought and a pretty heavy helping of rationalization, either ride precariously along the razor's edge of what constitutes making God images or fall squarely on the side of idolatry. So I just want to throw that little caution out there. Now, as we move down the list of these clandestine sins, next in verse 17, we find that illegally moving a neighbor's property boundary marker is mentioned. I'm going to point out from time to time, like I have before, that many of these laws and sins are very common for the cultures of that era. Babylonian boundary stones have been found with similar curses written on them for anyone who would move the boundaries, usually describing the severe punishment involved that is a combination of what the king's going to do to you and some divine curse visited upon you by the local god. For the Hebrews, though, this was more a crime against God than against the legal landowner. See, God purposely divided up the land among the tribes of Israel in a certain fashion. So now, for a man to try to change that division, well, this was a great affront to God. Great affront to God. Further, the Lord owned the land of Israel. So, it was, and it remains, his holy property. Something we need to remember today when we think about Israel. Think about the gall of the nations saying, forget it, God, we'll divide up your land the way we see fit. Think what that means. What did we just learn? What have we learned since the beginning of Torah? The land of Israel is God's holy property. Messing with God's holy property is really foolish. In the Bible, it brings the death sentence. We must always remember this important God principle as well. Even the Israelites do not own the promised land. They are land tenants, but they are the only authorized land tenants. In the past, they had been allowed to stay in the land only so long as they obeyed God. When they passed some line in the sand that their rebellion became too great for even God's mercy, they were evicted for a time. I want to be clear, however, that no one else other than the Hebrews have any right to be there. God has not granted permission for foreigners to be there except as part of Israel. Now, verse 18 says that no one is to cause a blind person to lose his way. And the idea is that no one's to take advantage of someone else's ignorance or disability by misleading them to your advantage, to their detriment. This is central to the fairness doctrine that's so woven into all of the Lord's commandments, and it certainly violates what both the Old Testament and the New state is the underlying foundation behind all laws and commandments. Love the Lord God and love your neighbor as yourself. Next is that no one is to interfere with the justice system for a foreigner, for a widow, for an orphan. Now, obviously, this is aimed at protecting the most vulnerable in society. And the violation is really more about a judge judging unfairly, not about a person's social or economic status. But now we get a series of 4 laws involving sexual behavior. And again, these laws are not exhaustive, covering every unacceptable sexual practice. They're just representative of all. Now, verse 20 speaks of a man who has relations with his stepmother, although technically it could include his own biological mother. Now, sick as that sounds to us, we know that it does happen. So this is hardly a reach. Interestingly, the argument against doing such a thing isn't so much that the inherent incestuous morality is the issue. Rather, it's because, as it says literally, the son who does that has removed his father's garment. That's what it literally says. Removed his father's garment. It's an affront to the father's honor. See, here's that inference that I taught you about some weeks ago, and we're going to see it many times in the Bible. That in the Holy Scriptures, a wife is often seen metaphorically as the garment that her husband puts on. I want to remind you, this is not meant as demeaning to a wife. Rather, she is a covering for her husband. He wears her, so to speak, as a covering, like you would a garment. Therefore, for a son to have sexual relations with his own mother or stepmother is a violation of something that exclusively belongs to his father. Now, verse 21 speaks of bestiality. Now, strange as that practice may seem to us, and as many off-colored jokes that have been invented revolving around that subject, it was rather common in ancient times, particularly in more rural areas. In fact, ancient Hittite laws prohibited this. We see in the pantheon of Middle and Near Eastern gods, half human, half animal gods and goddesses. We read in Greek mythology of similar creatures, and they are the result of sexual activity between humans and animals, or divinity in animals. This activity was largely acceptable in most societies, to one degree or another, but it was completely outlawed in every circumstance in Israel. Now, one doesn't have to look very far in the Bible to find the God pattern that makes bestiality unthinkable. Adam and Eve is the representative type of human sexuality and marriage union. Adam was actually given the opportunity to have animals as domestic partners, not sexual partners, but decided that none of them were suitable. Therefore, the Lord created from him a female as the only appropriate domestic and sexual partner for him. I want to be clear. God was not inviting Adam to have sex with animals, and then Adam refused. Rather, it is that in the Genesis narrative, it is at least partially for the purpose of making it clear that mankind is not to try to procreate or come into union with lesser beings not of our species, and that the only acceptable domestic companion for a man is a human woman, and vice versa. And it's amazing that apparently this lesson has to be retaught over and over again, and that nation after nation eventually figures that this law of God no longer applies to us. Well, this is followed then in verse 23 with another law that defines incest. A man is not to have relations with his sister or a stepsister. Next is a curse on the one who commits a violent act against another Israelite. And it does not necessarily limit the acts to violence to murder. It can refer to assault. Verse 25 speaks of not accepting a bribe to help a murderer go free. This is speaking of a judge, a witness, or even hiring a person to commit a murder for you. The unintended consequence of such an act is that the blood guilt caused by the unjustified killing will remain upon the land until the murderer has had his own life taken from him. The 12th curse is that general one that I told you about. It refers to all the other teachings of the Torah and demands that the Torah be followed, or the person who breaks it will be cursed. Rashi says that it essentially is an oath taken by each and every Israelite to uphold the entire Torah. Now notice that after every reading of a curse, it's followed with an Amen from the people. A person who responds to a prayer or a vow, or in this case a covenant, by saying Amen, let it be so with me. It was agreement with the terms of the covenant and used as a kind of shortcut for the person to publicly accept the terms. Earlier in Exodus and Leviticus, we went through this tedious process whereby God would tell Moses what to say, then we read about Moses saying it to the people, then we read about the people doing it. Page after page after page of the Torah was essentially repeating the same instruction at least twice, sometimes 3 times, because this is simply how it was done in the ancient Middle East. It was just custom. Here in Deuteronomy is a deviation from this process. We see a declaration made, or we see an instruction given, and rather than the people repeating everything, the people simply responded, Amen, to what was pronounced. I want to end today with this thought. I said at the beginning that this chapter actually speaks of multiple covenant renewal ceremonies, and no doubt there were other covenant renewal ceremonies held at appropriate times. Why? Why did God need to have Israel keep reaffirming their faith with him over and over again? The reality is, this was customary. It was traditional for that era. We have Assyrian, Mesopotamian, Hittite, Canaanite, other law code documents that are very similar in form to what we find here in Deuteronomy. And what we find is that repetition, or saying essentially the same thing in the positive, then later in the negative, or using multiple examples, this was the norm. The curses stated concerning any regulation were always more numerous than any blessings. Repetition helps us to remember. Got to recall, people didn't have scrolls, they didn't have books with these instructions written down so that they could easily refer to them. So saying them over and over imprinted these laws in their minds. And never forget that while Israel is indeed God's set apart people, they are first and foremost people. Consciously or not, we all make decisions and communicate within the context of our era and our culture and our language. We find out just how true that is when we visit a foreign country and things that we take for granted in our own nation are completely unknown to them. Something as simple as which side of the road you drive on varies around the world. It was no different for Israel. It was natural for them to communicate to God, for God to communicate to them within the context of their own culture. Or better, within the rather extensive set of customs and traditions that were common throughout the known world at that time. Therefore, even though the Bible is inspired, perhaps the larger miracle is that God's divine perfection and truth can be expressed through the imperfect, somewhat arbitrary customs and traditions of mere men that aren't always the most edifying in their nature. The form of the Mosaic covenant is not heavenly. It's earthbound, intended for human beings to follow. The way it is structured would have been very familiar to any person in the Middle or Near East at that era. You see, it's the divine principles expressed in it that matter, not so much its form. Next week, we'll move into Deuteronomy chapter 28, and we'll study the blessings that were pronounced by the priests. Please rise.
Yeshua.